The winter had turned cruel in the mountains of northern Arizona. The snow kept falling day after day, and the cold wind howled through the pines like a lost spirit. In a small wooden cabin far from the town, an old ranch hand named Elias Warren sat by a dim fire. He had spent most of his life working on cattle ranches, mending fences, and driving herds under the sun. But this year he had lost his job when the ranch closed, and now he lived alone with only his old dog Buck for company. The fire was dying down. Elias rubbed his hands together and looked at the empty shelf where flour and beans used to be. His pockets were nearly empty. Tomorrow he planned to walk to the trading post to buy what little food he could with the few coins he had left. Outside, the storm didn't care whether a man lived or died. It blew through every crack in the door, whispering cold into his bones. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot listening to the wind press against the windows. The silence after each gust made him feel how alone he truly was. Sometimes he thought about his wife, Clara, who had passed years ago from fever. Since she died, he had forgotten what laughter sounded like inside the cabin. Still, he got up every morning, chopped wood, sold it in town, and tried to keep living. The next morning, the snow was knee-deep. Elias wrapped himself in his heavy coat, put a wool scarf around his neck, and started walking toward the trading post, with Buck following behind. His boots crunched in the frozen path, and every breath came out as white mist. After 2 hours, the small town finally appeared, with smoke curling from chimneys and the smell of coffee from the general store. Inside, the store was warm. A few men stood near the stove talking about ranch work and government news. Elias quietly placed his few coins on the counter. "Need flour, salt, and maybe some beans," he said. The storekeeper, Mr. Doolin, looked at the coins and shook his head. "Ain't much you can get for that, Elias. Maybe a loaf of bread and a handful of beans if you stretch it." Elias sighed. "That'll do." As the storekeeper packed the food, a sudden noise came from outside, the sound of people shouting. The door opened and cold air rushed in. A young boy entered and said, "There's an Indian woman out there sitting by the road. She's near froze to death." The men near the stove frowned but didn't move. One said, "Best leave her. Probably from one of them tribes the soldiers moved last week." Another muttered, "She don't belong here." Elias felt something stir inside him. He looked out the frosty window and saw her, a young woman sitting in the snow by the road. Her skin was dark from the sun, her hair tangled, and her hands were bare. She wasn't moving much, just staring at the ground, shivering under a torn blanket. People passed her as if she wasn't there. Elias turned to the storekeeper. "How long's she been there?" "Since this morning," the man said. "Someone brought her into town, but no one wanted to deal with her. She won't last the night." Elias looked at the bread and beans on the counter, then at the last few coins in his hand. His stomach twisted. Those coins were all he had left. But leaving her there didn't sit right in his soul. He knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to be left behind when the world didn't care. Without saying a word, he reached into the bin near the wall and pulled out an old wool blanket, a small loaf of bread, and a pair of worn boots that had been sitting unsold for months. "Put these in," he told the storekeeper. "Elias, you can't afford. Just do it," he said quietly. When he stepped outside, the wind hit him hard. He walked toward the woman slowly, afraid she might collapse if startled. Buck trotted beside him, wagging his tail softly. The woman's eyes lifted when she saw them. They were dark and full of fear, but also hope. Elias knelt beside her. Her lips were blue, her fingers trembling. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently. She blinked but didn't answer. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, placed the bread in her hands, and said, "Eat." She looked at the bread as if she had forgotten what food was. After a moment, she took a small bite and tears filled her eyes. Elias saw her feet, bare, red, and swollen. He pulled out the boots and tried to hand them to her. She hesitated, whispering something in a soft voice he couldn't understand. Her language was foreign, but her pain was clear. He spoke slowly. "It's all right. You wear these." She finally let him help her. Her hands were so cold that she couldn't tie the laces, so he did it for her. Then he stood and said, "You can't stay here. You'll die." She didn't move. He pointed toward the mountains. "My cabin," he said. "Warm. Fire." Then he gestured for her to stand. She looked frightened, unsure whether to trust him. But when she tried to rise, she nearly fell. Elias caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're all right?" He turned to the storekeeper's wagon parked nearby. "I'm borrowing this," he said, and without waiting for an answer, lifted the woman carefully into the wagon bed, covering her with blankets. Buck jumped in beside her as if guarding her. The road back to the cabin was rough and slow. The snow fell harder, and the sky turned gray. Elias had to stop often to clear the path. Each time he looked back, he saw her shivering under the blankets, eyes closed but still breathing. By the time they reached the cabin, night had already fallen. The fire inside had gone out. Elias quickly carried her inside, laid her on his own bed, and piled more blankets over her. Buck curled at her feet, his warm body pressing against her legs. Elias lit the fire, the flames dancing in the darkness. He boiled water and made a thin soup from what he had left. He spooned a little to her lips and she tried to drink. Her hands trembled so much that he had to hold the bowl for her. She whispered something again, soft, broken words in her language. Elias didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. "You're safe now," he said. "Rest." Outside, the storm roared louder. The wind shook the cabin walls, but inside the warmth began to grow. Elias sat by the fire, watching her sleep, her face peaceful now under the flickering light. He thought about how strange life was. This morning he had worried about food and money. Tonight none of that seemed to matter. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to care. As he sat there, Buck laid his head on Elias's knee and sighed. Elias looked down and whispered, "We did the right thing, old boy." The fire crackled, the snow fell outside, and in that small cabin in the middle of nowhere, a lonely man and a freezing woman began the first night of a story neither of them could have imagined. For the first time in a long time, Elias didn't feel alone. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why fate had crossed their paths. But one thing was sure. He couldn't let her die out there in the snow. She was a stranger, yes, but something deep inside told him that saving her might also save him. As the night went on, the storm kept trying to break through the roof, yet the cabin stood strong. Elias fed the fire until dawn, never once taking his eyes off the woman he had rescued. Somewhere in that long and silent night, two lives had quietly begun to change forever. When the morning light crept through the cabin window, the storm had finally stopped. The world outside was white and silent, like the whole valley had fallen asleep under a thick blanket of snow. Inside, the small fire still burned low, and Elias sat in his chair watching the woman sleep. She hadn't moved much through the night. Her breathing was slow but steady, and that gave him comfort. Elias rubbed his hands together and stood up carefully. He didn't want to wake her, but he wanted to make something warm before she opened her eyes. He stirred the last bit of beans into a pot, added water, and placed it near the fire. The smell of cooking filled the cabin. Buck, his old dog, lifted his head and wagged his tail lazily, as if he also knew the morning would be different. After a while, the woman stirred. She turned her head slowly, blinking in confusion. When she saw Elias sitting nearby, she looked startled and tried to sit up, but her weak body wouldn't let her. Elias raised a hand gently and said, "Easy now. You're safe. Don't be afraid." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rough walls, the shelves with tools, the fire crackling, and the small pot on the stove. She spoke something softly in her language, her voice low and hoarse. Elias didn't understand the words, but he could see the question in her eyes. "Where am I?" He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Elias." Then he pointed to her, tilting his head to ask her name. She hesitated before whispering, "Taya." He nodded. "Taya," he repeated gently. "Good name." He poured some of the warm beans into a tin bowl and held it out to her. "Eat. You need food." She looked unsure at first, but hunger won. Her hand shook as she took the spoon. After the first few bites, her eyes closed for a moment as if she hadn't tasted real food in weeks. Elias smiled quietly. He turned to tend the fire while she ate. The cabin filled with the sound of small crackles and the wind brushing against the window. It was the kind of silence that felt peaceful rather than empty. When she finished eating, she leaned back and closed her eyes again. Elias covered her with an extra blanket and went outside to check on the woodpile. The snow was piled high, reaching nearly to the roof. He spent the next few hours chopping firewood, his breath puffing white in the cold air. Every few minutes he glanced through the window to see if she was still resting. By noon the cabin was warm again. When he came back in, she was awake and watching him quietly. Buck lay beside her, his head resting near her arm. Elias chuckled. "He doesn't trust many folks," he said softly. "Guess he likes you." Taya smiled faintly, her first smile since she arrived. She tried to say something but struggled to find the right words. "Dog, kind," she managed. Elias nodded. "Yes, he's a good one." Over the next few days, the two of them slowly found a rhythm. Elias kept the fire going, brought in wood, and cooked what little food he had. Taya helped where she could, washing the tin bowls, sweeping the floor, or folding blankets. She still moved weakly, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger with each sunrise. Sometimes, when Elias was working, she would hum softly, a tune that sounded ancient and peaceful. It reminded him of the songs Clara used to hum when she cooked. That sound filled the cabin with warmth that no fire could give. One evening, as the snow fell again outside, Elias sat sharpening his knife while Taya sat near the fire mending his torn coat. He watched her hands move with quiet skill. After a while, he said, "You sew better than me." She looked up, smiled shyly, and said in broken English, "My mother, teach me." Elias nodded. "She taught you well." Taya lowered her eyes again, and after a long pause, she whispered, "Mother gone." Her voice trembled and her hands stopped moving. Elias felt a deep ache in his chest. He wanted to say something comforting, but words often failed him. Instead, he said softly, "I lost my wife. Long time ago." Taya lifted her eyes. "You alone?" He nodded. "Yes, just me and Buck. Been that way for years." For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the fire. Then Taya spoke quietly. "Now, not alone." Elias looked at her, surprised. Her words were simple, but they carried warmth that reached him deeply. He smiled faintly. "No, I guess not," he said. Days turned into weeks. The snow outside began to melt little by little. Taya's cheeks grew less pale, her movements stronger. She began to speak more English, learning from Elias every day. Sometimes he'd point at an object and say its name. "Chair, door, fire, your," and she would repeat after him, laughing when she got it right. In return, she taught him a few Apache words. "Nana," she said one morning, pointing at the sun. "Sun, Nana," he repeated clumsily. She laughed and corrected him gently. Their small lessons became the best part of each day. Through broken words and gestures, they learned to understand each other, not just through speech, but through kindness. One morning, Elias woke to find her outside, struggling to chop wood. Her hands shook from the cold, but she kept swinging the axe. "Taya!" he shouted, stepping out quickly. "You'll hurt yourself." She turned and smiled. "Work keeps warm," she said simply. Elias sighed, but couldn't help smiling too. "All right, but I'll finish the heavy logs." Together they worked side by side until the sun rose higher, their breath mixing in the frosty air. Later that day, Elias noticed her near the door, looking at the sky with a faraway gaze. He asked quietly, "You thinking about home?" She nodded. "Tribe far, many gone, some taken," her eyes filled with sadness. Elias said softly, "You'll see them again someday." She shook her head. "Maybe not, but here, safe." He didn't know what to say to that. He simply nodded and threw another log on the fire. That evening, as they ate together, she said something unexpected. "You kind, Elias, why?" He stopped mid-bite, thinking. Then he said, "Because someone should be. When the world gets cold, kindness is the only fire we got left." She looked at him quietly for a long moment, as if his words meant more than he realized. Then she said softly, "Good heart?" The days passed peacefully, though not without struggle. Food was still scarce, and sometimes Elias went to bed hungry so Taya could eat more. She tried to share equally, but he always gave her the bigger portion when she wasn't looking. One night, as they sat watching the flames, she asked, "You no afraid?" "People in town?" "No like my people." Elias stared into the fire for a moment. "Maybe they don't, but I don't care what they think. You're not trouble, Taya. You're just a person trying to live, same as me." She looked down, touched her blanket, and whispered, "You different." "Not hate." Elias smiled softly. "Hate never built a fire. Only love and mercy can do that." Outside the wind blew again, but inside the cabin there was warmth, not just from the flames, but from the quiet bond forming between them. They didn't need many words to understand each other anymore. A look, a small smile, or a shared silence was enough. By the time the last snow began to melt and small patches of green appeared outside, the cabin no longer felt like a lonely place. It felt like a home again. Elias often caught himself humming without realizing it, just like he used to long ago. Taya would glance at him, amused, and hum along softly in her own tune. The two melodies would mix, one old and broken, one wild and new, and together they filled the air with something beautiful. When he lay down that night, Elias looked at the firelight flickering on the wooden ceiling. He thought about how much had changed since the night he carried a half-frozen stranger into his cabin. He had given her warmth, but she had given him something greater, a reason to keep living. The mountain winter had taken almost everything from him, but it had given him one unexpected gift, a quiet friendship born from compassion. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew that something deep and lasting had begun to grow between them. In that cabin, far from the noise of the world, two broken souls had found warmth in each other, and the long, cold season was finally starting to end. The spring sun slowly melted the last patches of snow that had covered the valley for months. The world around the cabin began to breathe again. The creek started flowing, birds returned to the tall pines, and the air carried the smell of wet soil. Elias stood outside one morning, leaning on his axe, watching the sunlight spread across the hills. After so many months of cold silence, the world seemed alive again. Inside the cabin, Taya was sweeping the floor, her long, dark hair shining in the morning light. She had grown stronger. Her cheeks now had color and her steps were steady. The woman who had once lain near death in the snow was now full of life. She had even made a small garden behind the cabin using broken tools and seeds Elias had kept from last year. "Spring good," she said, smiling when Elias came inside with firewood. He nodded. "It surely is. Time to plant, mend, and fix what the winter broke." She poured him a cup of hot tea made from pine needles and smiled proudly. "I make this," she said in her soft English. Elias took a sip, and his eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Well, That's good." Taya laughed, a sound that filled the cabin like music. Buck barked happily as if joining in. For a moment, Elias just watched her laugh, realizing how much joy she had brought into his quiet world. They worked together that day, clearing fallen branches and repairing the fence that surrounded the small clearing. Elias cut new posts while Taya handed him the tools. Though they didn't talk much, there was a calm rhythm between them. When she worked, she hummed a soft tune in her language, and Elias found himself humming along without even knowing why. As the days passed, the little garden behind the cabin began to grow. Taya planted beans, herbs, and wildflowers she had found in the woods. She taught Elias how to use stones to hold the warmth of the sun near the plants. He teased her gently, saying, "You're making this place prettier than I ever did." Taya smiled. "Home must have life," she said simply. Elias looked at her for a moment and replied, "Yes, home must." He realized then that for the first time in years, the word home actually meant something again, but not everything outside the cabin was peaceful. One afternoon, while Elias was splitting wood, two men rode up on horses. They were local ranch hands he knew from town, rough men who always had something to say about everyone. One of them, Hank Peters, looked down from his horse and called out, "Elias, heard you took in one of them Apache women." Elias straightened up slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "She was freezing to death," he said evenly. Hank smirked. "Well, that's nature's way. Folks in town say it ain't right you keep her out here. Soldiers been rounding up runaways. They'll come asking soon enough." The second man added, "If they find her here, you'll be in trouble too." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm not turning her out. She's done nothing wrong." Hank spat in the dirt. "Suit yourself, old man. Don't come crying when they haul you off." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of dust. Elias watched them go, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't care much about gossip, but soldiers were another matter. He knew how cruel people could be when fear took over. That evening, Taya noticed his silence. "Bad men?" she asked gently. Elias sat by the fire, staring at the flames. "Men from town. They said soldiers might come." Taya's face turned pale. "Soldiers take my people. No, come back." Elias looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. "They won't take you." "I won't let them." Taya shook her head. "You helped me before. No need more trouble." He leaned forward. "Taya, listen to me. You belong here now. This is your home too." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked softly. Then Taya whispered, "I stay. Only if safe." Elias nodded firmly. "You are." The next few days passed in uneasy peace. They kept working, planting, fixing, living, but both knew that someone might come. Every sound of hooves on the trail made Elias's heart tighten. Still, he never spoke of fear again. He didn't want Taya to see it. One morning, she was by the river washing clothes when she saw Elias walking toward her with a small wooden box. He smiled awkwardly and said, I made you something. He opened the box to reveal a simple necklace made from smooth river stones and a small silver button, the last thing he had kept from his wife's coat. Taya touched it gently. Beautiful, she whispered. It ain't much, Elias said, rubbing his neck. But I figured you should have something that's yours. She looked up at him and said softly, No one ever give me gift before. Elias didn't know what to say. He just smiled, and for a moment their eyes met, full of quiet gratitude and understanding. The days grew warmer and the hills bloomed with color. Sometimes they sat outside in the evenings watching the sunset. Taya would tell short stories from her tribe, using her hands to show meaning when words failed. Elias listened closely, fascinated. Once she pointed at the sky and said, My people believe stars are campfires of our ancestors. They watch us, Elias nodded slowly. Then I reckon your folks are proud of you keeping this place alive. She smiled. And your wife? She watched too? His eyes softened. Maybe she does. Maybe she sent you here so I wouldn't die of loneliness. Taya didn't answer, but she reached out and placed her hand over his for a brief moment. It was a quiet gesture, but it spoke more than words. One afternoon, a storm rolled through the valley, quick and fierce. They worked together to tie down the roof and bring the animals inside. The wind screamed outside, but the cabin held strong. When it was over, the rainbow stretched across the sky. Beautiful, Taya whispered, looking at it through the window. Elias nodded. Never seen one so bright. She turned to him and said softly, Storm and rainbow, same sky. Bad and good live together. He smiled at her wisdom. You've got a way of saying things that make sense to my old head. By now their bond was unspoken but real. They were two souls who had survived life's storms and somehow found each other in the quiet after. But just as life seemed to settle, the outside world came knocking again. A few days later, a group of soldiers passed through the valley, their uniforms bright against the green hills. Elias watched from the trees as they rode down the trail. They stopped near his cabin, speaking to each other in low voices. He couldn't hear what they said, but he knew they were looking for runaway natives. He returned to the cabin quickly. Soldiers, he whispered. Stay inside. Don't make a sound. Taya froze, fear flashing in her eyes. If they find me, they won't, he said firmly. Trust me. He stood by the door, heart pounding. After what felt like an hour, the sound of horses faded. The soldiers had gone another way. Elias let out a shaky breath. Taya stepped out slowly. They gone, he nodded. For now. She looked at him, really looked, and said, You risk for me again. Elias shrugged. It's what friends do, she smiled faintly. No, you more than friend. He didn't answer, but his face said enough. That night they sat by the fire in silence. The danger had passed, but their hearts were still racing. When Taya finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. I stay here, work, help you. You help me. We live same. Elias looked at her with a small, tired smile. Yes, Taya. We live same. Outside, the night was peaceful again. The stars shone bright above the dark pines like tiny fires burning in the sky, just as Taya had said. Inside, the two of them sat close to the fire, their shadows moving together on the wooden wall. They didn't need words to know what they had found: trust, companionship, and the start of something far deeper than either had expected when their paths first crossed that freezing night. In that quiet spring, as the land came back to life, so did they, two souls learning that sometimes the heart finds home in the most unexpected places. The summer sun brought color to the valley, turning the once frozen land into a field of gold and green. The sound of the river, the songs of birds, and the warm breeze made the cabin feel alive again. Elias and Taya worked from sunrise to sunset, planting, mending, and living in quiet peace. Their small garden had begun to bear fruit, and their days felt almost like a dream. But peace in the wild never lasted long. One bright morning, Elias was fixing the fence near the trail when he saw a cloud of dust in the distance. His heart tightened. Riders were coming. He shaded his eyes with his hand and watched. It wasn't ranchers this time. It was soldiers. Their blue coats and polished rifles glimmered in the sun as they rode closer, 4 in total. Elias felt a coldness inside, the same kind that no fire could chase away. He hurried to the cabin. "Taya," he called softly, "get inside." "Soldiers are coming." Her face turned pale. She froze for a moment, then whispered, "They find me. They take me away." Elias placed his hands on her shoulders. "Don't worry. I'll handle it." She looked at him with frightened eyes. "They hurt my people before." "I know," he said quietly, "but I won't let that happen to you." He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The sound of hooves grew louder until the 4 riders stopped in front of the cabin. Dust settled around them. Their leader, a tall man with a thick mustache, looked down from his horse. "You Elias Warren?" he asked sharply. "I am," Elias said calmly, though his heart was racing. "We're looking for a woman," the soldier said. "Apache. Escaped from relocation camp down south. We got word she was seen around these parts." Elias folded his arms. "Ain't seen anyone like that." The soldier's eyes narrowed. "You sure? Folks in town said you've been keeping company here." Elias's jaw tightened. "I live alone." Another soldier dismounted, peering at the cabin. "Mind if we take a look?" he said, already moving toward the door. Elias stepped in front of him. "You got a warrant?" The leader snorted. "We don't need one. Orders from the fort." "Move aside." Elias didn't move. "She's done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "If she's just trying to live, that ain't a crime." The soldiers glanced at each other. The leader's voice hardened. "Step aside, old man, before we make you." Inside the cabin, Taya could hear everything. Her hands trembled as she clutched the small necklace Elias had made for her. She knew if they found her, they'd take her far away, and Elias might get hurt trying to stop them. Elias's heart pounded, but he stood tall. "You're not taking anyone from here," he said quietly but with strength. "This is my home." The leader dismounted and came close. "You're interfering with military duty," he warned. "I'm protecting a life," Elias replied. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was heavy with tension. Buck growled low near the porch, ready to defend his master. Then from inside the cabin, the door creaked open. Taya stepped out slowly. She stood barefoot in the sunlight, her face calm, though her hands shook slightly. "No fight," she said softly. "I go if need." Elias turned sharply toward her. "No, you stay." She looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You helped me once." "I not want you hurt," the leader smirked. "Looks like the lady's smarter than you." Before anyone could move, one of the younger soldiers, barely older than 20, spoke up. "Sir, she doesn't look like trouble." "Maybe she's not the one we're after." The leader glared at him. "You keep quiet, Private." Elias stepped forward. "She's not hurting anyone. She's been living here, farming, trying to survive. Let her be." The soldier hesitated, studying Elias's face, the honesty, the worn lines of a man who meant what he said. Finally, he turned back to his men. "Fine, we'll be back. But if we find out you're lying, it won't end well." They turned their horses and rode away, the sound of hooves fading down the trail. Elias stood there motionless until the dust settled. Only then did he turn to Taya. She was trembling. He went to her and took her hands gently. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe," her voice broke. "You fight soldiers. For me." Elias smiled faintly. "I just told the truth. You didn't deserve to be taken." Taya touched his arm and whispered, "No one ever protected me before." He looked at her, really looked, and realized how much she had come to mean to him. Her courage, her gentleness, her quiet strength had filled the empty spaces in his life. That night, the two sat by the fire without speaking much. The danger had passed for now, but both knew it could return any time. The cabin, though safe for the moment, felt surrounded by invisible threats. As the firelight flickered, Elias said quietly, "If things get bad, we'll go north. There's land up there, open, quiet, no one to bother us." Taya nodded. "If you go, I go," he smiled. "Then we'll go together." The days after that visit were filled with cautious peace. They avoided town, stayed close to the hills, and kept their work steady. Elias set traps in the forest, and Taya gathered berries and herbs. Together they built a small smokehouse to dry meat for winter. One evening as they worked, a distant thunderstorm rolled over the mountains. Taya looked up at the sky and said, "Sky angry." Elias chuckled. Just loud talk. It'll pass. But as the storm approached, lightning flashed and thunder shook the earth. They hurried inside just as rain poured down in sheets. Water hit the roof hard and the sound filled the cabin. Taya sat near the fire, hugging her knees. The lightning frightened her. It reminded her of the gunfire and screams she had heard when soldiers attacked her people long ago. Elias noticed her trembling and sat beside her. "You're safe here," he said softly. She looked at him with wide eyes. "Always safe. With you." Elias hesitated, then gently took her hand. "You've been brave, Taya. You've brought this place back to life. I thought I was saving you that night, but maybe it was the other way around." Her eyes softened and she smiled faintly. "We save each other." They sat in silence, listening to the storm fade away. When the rain stopped, the air smelled fresh and clean. A rainbow appeared through the window, bright and wide, stretching across the valley. Taya stood and whispered, "Promise from sky." "After storm, always light," Elias smiled. "I like that." That night the air was calm again. The moonlight slipped through the window, lighting Taya's necklace, the one Elias had made. She held it in her hand, thinking about how far she had come from that freezing road where her life had almost ended. A few weeks later, the young soldier who had spoken up during the standoff returned quietly, alone. He came on horseback holding a small sack of flour and a note. "From me," he said. "For what it's worth, I told the captain you weren't hiding anyone dangerous. They won't be back." Elias shook his hand firmly. "You did the right thing, son." The soldier smiled shyly. "Just seemed wrong the way they talked about her. Take care of each other." Then he rode off, leaving the small cabin in peace once more. That evening, Elias told Taya what had happened. She looked thoughtful, then said, "Good man. Maybe not all soldiers bad." Elias nodded. "There's good and bad everywhere, I guess. Just takes courage to be kind." From that day forward, they stopped living in fear. They still worked hard, tending crops, fixing tools, preparing for winter. But now they did it with quiet confidence. Each sunrise felt like a gift they had earned. Elias often caught himself smiling while watching Taya hum and water the garden. She would sometimes look up and tease, "Why you smile?" He'd reply, "Because this place used to be cold and empty. Now it's full of life." As summer faded into autumn, golden leaves covered the ground. Their small home had become a true shelter, not just from the weather, but from loneliness, fear, and sorrow. They had both lost much in their lives, but together, they had found peace. One crisp evening, Taya cooked stew while Elias carved wood by the fire. The smell filled the room, rich and warm. She handed him a bowl and said, "You make cabins strong. You make me strong." He smiled, taking a bite. "No, Taya. You're the one who gave this place a heart again." Outside, the night wind carried the sound of distant coyotes. Inside, the two of them shared quiet laughter. The firelight danced on their faces, the faces of two people who had chosen kindness over fear and courage over silence. Neither of them knew what the next season would bring. But one thing was certain: whatever came, they would face it together. Because in a world that could be cruel and cold, they had built something rare, a home made not from walls and wood, but from trust, loyalty, and compassion, and that bond, stronger than any storm or soldier, would be the light that guided them through every dark night still to come. The years passed quietly in the valley, and the cabin that once stood lonely in the snow became a warm home full of life. The seasons came and went. The river froze in winter, the hills bloomed in spring, and golden leaves drifted down every autumn. Through it all, Elias and Taya stayed side by side, living a simple life of work, peace, and quiet happiness. By the time another winter came, Elias's hair had turned white and his steps had grown slower. He still chopped wood and fixed fences, but his hands often trembled when he worked. Taya, now stronger and wiser than before, took care of most of the chores. She cooked, kept the fire burning, and made sure he rested. Whenever he tried to lift something heavy, she would shake her head and say gently, "No, you sit." "I do." Elias would laugh softly. "You sound like my late wife," he'd say, smiling. Taya would answer with her calm voice. Then she was wise. They had been together for many years now, but neither counted the days. Time had become a friend to them, slow, kind, and filled with meaning. Their little garden had grown into a fine patch of green every summer. Neighbors from the nearby valley sometimes came by, not to judge anymore, but to ask for herbs or to trade eggs and flour. Word had spread about the kind old man and the gentle Apache woman who helped anyone who knocked on their door. One cold evening, a young couple arrived at the cabin. Their wagon had broken down and their baby was crying from hunger. Without hesitation, Taya brought them inside, gave them food, and let them sleep by the fire. The next morning, as the sun rose, the couple looked at Elias with tears in their eyes. "You saved us," the young man said. "We didn't think anyone would stop for strangers." Elias smiled. "Someone once saved me too. Kindness goes both ways." When the couple left, Taya stood beside him at the door and whispered, "You heart still strong." He chuckled. "It's you that keeps it beating." Life had become calm, but Elias could feel the years catching up with him. He tired easily now. Sometimes when he sat by the fire, he'd drift into long thoughts, not sad, just deep. He remembered his days as a ranch hand, the wife he lost, and that cold night when he found Taya half buried in snow. He often wondered what would have happened if he had walked past her like everyone else. But every time he looked at her face full of warmth and quiet strength, he knew that night had been his greatest blessing. One afternoon, as snow began to fall softly outside, Elias sat by the window watching Taya feed the birds near the porch. Her long hair was streaked with silver now, but she still moved with the same grace as the young woman he had rescued years ago. She turned and smiled at him, and his heart felt full. When she came inside, she said cheerfully, "Winter comes fast this year." He nodded slowly. "Yes, it does. Feels like the years are running ahead of me." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You still strong? You live long." Elias smiled. "Maybe, but if not, I'll rest easy. I've had more peace in these years with you than in all my life before." Taya frowned slightly. "Don't talk like that." He looked at her kindly. "I'm not afraid. I just mean, life's been good to me more than I deserved." That night, as the snow fell heavy, the two sat near the fire. Taya was mending a blanket while Elias carved a small wooden bird. He had made many small carvings, birds, animals, little figures, and Taya had placed them on a shelf above the fire. When he finished, he handed the new one to her. "For you," he said softly. She took it, smiling gently. "You always make good things with hands." He nodded. "Hands remember what the heart wants to say." She didn't quite understand, but she held the carving close. It was a little bird with open wings, as if ready to fly. Days turned into weeks and the snow piled higher outside. Elias grew weaker. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed until Taya helped him sit up. He laughed it off, saying, "Guess I'm getting old, huh?" But she could see the worry in his eyes. She did everything for him. Made his tea, fed the fire, read from an old Bible he had kept for years. Sometimes she sat beside him in silence, just holding his hand. One night, as the wind howled through the pines, Elias woke and called her name softly. "Taya," she turned from the fire. "I'm here," he smiled faintly. "Do you remember the day I found you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Cold, snow, you come. You give blanket." He nodded. "I didn't know it then, but saving you saved me too. You brought warmth back into this place," her eyes filled with tears. "You my family," she said softly. "No blood, but heart." He reached out and took her hand. "That's what family really is." The fire flickered, and for a while they just sat together, saying nothing more. The silence was gentle, filled with love and understanding. In the days that followed, Elias grew quieter. He slept more and spoke less. Taya stayed by his side, refusing to leave the cabin even when neighbors offered help. She could feel that his time was nearing its end, and she wanted every last moment to count. One morning, after a long night of snow, Elias woke to the soft glow of dawn. Taya was sitting beside him, holding his hand. He smiled weakly. "Look," he whispered, "the light's coming through the window. Beautiful, isn't it?" Taya nodded, her eyes glistening. He looked at her with tired but peaceful eyes. "Promise me you'll keep the fire burning," he said quietly. "Don't let the cabin go cold." "I promise," she whispered, her voice shaking. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Good. You've been my light, Taya, my last and best chapter." His voice faded, and as the morning sun touched the window, Elias's eyes slowly closed. The warmth from the fire flickered across his face, peaceful and calm, like a man who had finally found rest. Taya sat beside him for a long time, tears streaming down her face. She didn't cry out. She just held his hand and whispered softly in her language. Words of thanks, words of love, words for the spirits to guide him home. When the sun rose high, she went outside. The snow sparkled under the golden light. The world was still, As if nature itself paused to honor the old man who had given everything for kindness, Taya carved a small wooden sign and placed it beside the cabin door. On it she wrote in shaky letters, "He gave all he had, and gave me life." Years later, travelers passing through the valley often spoke of a quiet woman who lived alone in a small cabin. They said she always had warm soup for the hungry and firewood for the cold. Some said she never asked for anything in return, only smiled and said, "Kindness is never lost." As time went on, her hair turned white like the snow she once lay in, but her spirit remained strong. And every winter she lit a candle in the window for Elias, a single steady light that burned through the longest nights. People in nearby towns began to call the place the Warm Cabin. Hunters, riders, and lost travelers always found a welcome there. Taya became a legend, the woman who never turned anyone away, no matter who they were. Long after she was gone, the cabin still stood among the pines. The wooden sign she carved stayed nailed to the door, weathered but readable. Travelers who found it often paused to whisper a prayer or leave a flower by the step. The story of Elias and Taya spread through the valley, a tale not of wealth or fame, but of a man who spent his last few dollars to save a stranger, and of a woman who turned his lonely cabin into a home filled with compassion. And so even when years passed and both were long gone, their kindness lived on in every traveler who shared bread with a stranger, every farmer who helped a lost soul, and every fire lit for someone cold and forgotten. Because some stories don't fade when the people do. They keep burning quietly like a flame that refuses to die. And in that silent valley, where the wind still whispers through the tall pines, it's said that on winter nights a faint light can still be seen glowing from the old cabin window. The last promise of a man who gave everything, and the love of a woman who kept the fire alive.